The air in the suburban neighborhood was still, almost too still for Echo. The old German shepherd sat near the bay window, his large ears twitching at the faintest of noises. A passing car, a door creak, the rustle of a squirrel in the hedges. Outside, he used to be able to sort through sounds like that with surgical precision. These days, it just made him restless. Behind him, Officer Karen Holt, retired now too, technically, watched the dog with a tightness in her chest. She understood more than anyone that adapting to civilian life wasn't easy. Not for her, and definitely not for Echo. Come on, big guy. You can relax, you know? She said gently, walking over and ruffling his ears. He didn't react, just continued staring out the window with that same fixed gaze. Karen sighed, stepping into the kitchen. The kettle was already whistling, its shrill call breaking the silence. Of the house. She poured herself a cup of tea and took a seat at the dining table, eyeing Echo from behind the rim of her mug. It had been 3 months since they'd both left the force. Karen had opted for early retirement after an injury during a raid had taken out her knee. Echo had aged out of the program around the same time, 10 years old, a decorated service dog, trained for bomb detection and search and rescue. Together, they'd seen the best and worst of humanity. Now, the days were marked not by mission briefings or fieldwork, but by short walks and longer silences. The vet had warned her. He'll probably struggle for a while. Some dogs have trouble adjusting. After service, they miss the stimulation, the structure. She'd nodded, knowing full well what that meant. Not just for Echo, but for her, too. It was the little things that stood out. Echo no longer ate with urgency. He'd grown used to the routine, but without the promise of action, even food seemed less important. At night, he paced the hallway before settling at her bedroom door, like he was waiting for someone to give him orders. When the mail came, he stiffened, alert, listening. But there was no threat here, only bills and circulars. And yet Echo remained ever vigilant. Maybe I should have gotten you a younger companion, Karen mused aloud, sipping her tea. Someone to play with. Take the edge off. Echo shifted slightly, ears turning toward her voice, but eyes still focused on the street. Later that day, Karen clipped on his leash for their afternoon walk. He moved beside her with the soldiers' discipline, never pulling, never straying. The sun was soft, peeking out between scattered clouds, and the neighborhood was quiet as ever. They passed manicured lawns, kids' bikes tossed carelessly on driveways, a distant bark or two from backyard pets. Echo didn't so much as glance at them. It was when they turned the corner onto Maple Street that Echo stopped. Karen noticed it too, a moving truck, new neighbors, a man and woman were unloading boxes, and a small boy was struggling with what looked like a plastic container full of toys. Echo stood rigid, his posture alert. It's okay, Karen said softly. But Echo didn't move. Then the boy tripped. The container crashed to the ground with a loud bang, and Karen saw Echo flinch. For a moment he crouched slightly, like he was ready to launch forward, muscles twitching, eyes locked. It wasn't an attack, of course, just a child and a clumsy spill. But Echo stayed tense. Karen placed a hand on his side. It's okay, Echo. It's not a drill. Slowly, his body relaxed. He blinked once, then looked up at her. They continued walking, but Karen didn't miss the way Echo kept glancing back, as if trying to interpret what had just happened. His brain was still wired for threat detection. A child dropping a box sounded, too close to a gunshot. A passing motorcycle felt like the rumble of a convoy. Everything peaceful held the potential for chaos. When they got home, Echo didn't settle right away. He moved from room to room, nose low to the ground, tail held stiff. Karen knew better than to scold him. Instead, she opened the sliding glass door to the backyard. He needed time. Echo stepped out and sniffed the breeze, his ears perked up at the sound of a crow overhead, and for a moment Karen saw a flicker of the dog he used to be, curious, focused. She watched from the kitchen window, remembering the last raid they'd done together. It had been a warehouse, cold, metallic, dangerous. Echo had sniffed out a stash of explosives no one else had found. He'd saved lives that night, gotten a commendation even, but you don't give medals to dogs who wake up whimpering from nightmares. You don't honor the ones who still check every room in a house for intruders, even years later. As the sun began to dip lower, Karen opened the door and called softly, "Come on in, Echo." He returned slowly, tail slightly lowered but not tucked. His eyes met hers, deep, soulful eyes that had seen more than most people ever would. That night, Karen lay in bed with the door ajar, as always. Echo's heavy form settled against the frame like a sentry. He sighed once, a deep, exhausted sound, and rested his head on his paws. Karen stared at the ceiling, her thoughts heavy. "We'll find a new purpose," she whispered. "Together." From the doorway, Echo's ears twitched. The morning was slow to rise. Karen awoke to the creak of the floorboards just outside her room. For a moment, instinct pulled her thoughts back to the old days, rushing awake at the sound of a breach, a door forced open, boots thundering down narrow corridors. But then reality settled in, warm and quiet. This was her house, her floor, and the creak came from Echo. He paced. Again. She sat up slowly, her body stiff from the cold and the years. Echo was at the end of the hall, his large frame silhouetted. Against the soft golden light spilling in from the living room window, he turned his head when she moved, ears perked, and padded silently back toward her. "Couldn't sleep?" she asked, rubbing her eyes. He gave a soft huff and lowered his head against her knee. Karen ran her fingers through the fur on his neck, still thick, though peppered with grey. It used to be sleeker, darker when he was in his prime. Now, like her time had softened him, joined the club. She stood and walked to the kitchen, Echo trailing at her side like a ghost. The coffee brewed in its slow, clunky way, sputtering steam into the silence. Karen leaned on the counter and stared out into the backyard. Morning dew coated the grass, and the neighbor's cat was already prowling along the fence line. "You're not even interested in chasing cats anymore," she said with a smile. Echo gave her a sideways glance. She poured her coffee and watched as Echo sat at his usual spot by the window, gaze fixed on the street. The moving truck was gone now, but the new family's SUV remained in the driveway, doors closed, curtains drawn. The little boy wasn't outside yet. Maybe it was too early, maybe he had school. It was strange how quiet everything had become. Back when they were active, Karen and Echo used to start their days with a different kind of energy. Briefings, gear, checks, communication drills. Echo thrived on the repetition and precision. Now the most structure he had was their morning walk and the occasional car ride to the vet. She walked over and knelt beside him. "You miss the noise, don't you?" His ear twitched. Karen sighed. "Yeah, me too." Later, she grabbed his leash and opened the door. As usual, Echo was ready. No leash tugging, no barking, just an alert posture and an even gait. They walked down the street, the morning sun gently warming the pavement. It was just as they turned back onto Maple Street that they saw him again. The boy. He was sitting on the front step with a tablet in his lap and a juice box beside him. His dark curls were a mess, and he wore mismatched socks. As they passed, he looked up. Echo stopped. Karen glanced down, surprised. Echo rarely broke stride. The boy looked at them both, then cautiously raised a hand. "Hi." Karen smiled. "Hey, there. What's his name?" the boy asked. "Echo." The boy blinked. Like an echo. Like a sound, Karen chuckled. "Exactly." The boy stood up, setting the tablet down carefully. "Can I pet him?" Karen hesitated. Echo wasn't dangerous, at least not unless given reason to be, but she never let anyone approach him too quickly, especially kids. Service dogs had boundaries, but Echo wasn't moving. He stood still, watching the boy with a look that was almost curious. Karen knelt beside him. "Echo, Stay. Echo didn't move. All right, she said, come slowly. The boy did, his hands outstretched but gentle. Echo sniffed the boy's fingers once, then cautiously he leaned forward and let him scratch behind one ear. I'm Mason, the boy said proudly. Nice to meet you, Mason, Karen replied. You new around here? Yeah, we just moved. My dad says I'm not allowed to have a dog because he's allergic, but I like dogs. Well, Echo's retired now. He used to work with me. We were in the K9 unit together. Mason's eyes lit up. Like police. Karen nodded. Exactly. That's so cool. Did he catch bad guys? Sometimes. Mostly he found things people didn't want us to find. Mason looked at Echo with new reverence. You're a hero, he whispered. Echo tilted his head, slightly, then nudged Mason's hand with his nose. For the first time in weeks, Karen saw his tail twitch, not a full wag, but a ghost of one. Do you walk him every day? Mason asked. Yeah, every morning and afternoon. Can I come sometimes? Karen hesitated. She didn't want Echo overwhelmed, but the look in the dog's eyes, focused but calm, gave her pause. Maybe. We'll see how Echo feels about that. Cool. Mason turned and shouted back toward his house. Dad! I met a real police dog. Karen winced slightly at the volume, but Echo didn't even flinch. Progress. That afternoon, Echo was more relaxed. He napped in the sun for the first time in weeks, his breathing steady, limbs not twitching in the grips of a dream. Karen watched him from her chair on the porch, a book in her lap she wasn't really reading. Later that evening, after dinner, she sat on the couch and opened the box she had stored away for too long. Inside were Echo's medals, tags, photos, and a worn leather collar with a K9 emblem. She laid them out on the coffee table one by one. Echo approached slowly. His nose twitched as he sniffed the collar. Then he sat beside her and rested his head in her lap. We did good, she whispered, but I think we've got more to do. Outside, wind rustled the leaves. Somewhere down the street, a boy's laughter echoed faintly in the distance. Echo closed his eyes. Days fell into a rhythm. Mornings began with a quiet shuffle of feet, Karen's worn slippers and Echo's careful steps. She brewed her coffee, while he checked the perimeter of the house like clockwork. Then came the walk, the same streets, the same turns, the same steady pace. But things had changed. Mason had begun waiting on the front step every morning. The moment he spotted them, he'd wave wildly, tablet abandoned, shoes usually untied. Echo, he'd shout, as if calling to an old friend. Echo never pulled away when Mason came running. He didn't wag his tail much. He was too dignified. For that, Karen liked to think, but he allowed the boy to rub his ears and scratch his chest, sometimes even giving a soft grunt of approval. It was a small thing, but Karen didn't miss the way Echo carried himself differently afterward. More alert, but not in the tense, watchful way she'd grown used to. He seemed aware, present, like he was beginning to shift out of survival mode. She had once read that dogs mourn in silence, that they carry stress the way soldiers do, in their muscles, their gait, in the way they choose where to sleep. Echo had spent 10 years bracing for threats. That didn't unwind overnight. Still, he was healing, bit by bit, but healing, Karen knew, wasn't always a straight line. It started on a Tuesday. Karen was in the living room, a stack of mail on the table and a half-eaten sandwich on a plate beside her. Echo had been sleeping peacefully near the fireplace, his chest rising and falling in a slow rhythm. It was the deepest she'd seen him sleep since they retired. Then came the sound. It was sharp, sudden. A car backfired on the street. Echo shot, up like a gunshot himself, ears flattened, body low, eyes wild. Echo, Karen said quickly, her heart skipping. It's okay. But it wasn't okay. Not to him. He barked, loud and forceful, rushing to the window in full defense mode. His muscles tensed, tail stiff. He growled, lips peeled back, scanning the street for danger. Karen stepped toward him, keeping her voice calm. "Hey, stand down, Echo. It's just a car." But he wasn't hearing her. His eyes were fixed outside, his breath coming fast. The bark had triggered something old, something buried but never forgotten. Karen reached out slowly and touched his shoulder. He flinched, but didn't growl at her, didn't recoil, just stood there vibrating with unease. "It's over," she whispered. "There's nothing out there." Echo blinked. Then he sat down hard and exhaled sharply, like the tension had all left him in one breath. His head lowered and he nudged her hand with his nose. Karen sank to the floor beside him. "I know," she murmured, wrapping her arms around his thick neck. "I know what that felt like." She didn't need to explain. He understood. That night, Echo paced again. Longer than usual. Karen watched from the doorway. "I think it's time we gave you more to do," she said softly. The next day, she made a call. By the end of the week, they had an appointment. It was a small local program, a therapy dog organization that paired former service dogs with veterans, schools, and nursing homes. Karen had heard about it from her physical therapist, whose son brought therapy dogs into trauma recovery groups. She'd always brushed it off. Echo wasn't a cuddly lapdog. He was precise, focused. He'd never been the kind of animal to let strangers pet his belly or lick their faces. But therapy came in different forms, and Echo didn't need to change. He just needed purpose. The intake interview was held at a small community center on the edge of town. The volunteer, a gentlewoman named Liza, had a kind face and a notepad filled with checklists. "He's got excellent composure," Liza said after observing Echo for a few minutes. "His posture's calm, his responses are measured." "Was he ever in a high-stress environment?" Karen smiled. "He was a police canine, 10 years. Liza raised her eyebrows. "Well, that explains the way he scanned the entire room the second he walked in." Karen chuckled. "He still does that at the grocery store." After a brief evaluation, Liza sat down beside her. "We've got a couple of opportunities he might be suited for. One's a reading program at the library. The other's a local memory care facility for seniors with dementia." Karen blinked. "You think he'd be good with seniors?" "Absolutely, especially with his training. Sometimes they don't want touch or eye contact. They just want presence, quiet companionship." Karen looked down at Echo, who was lying obediently at her feet, his ears angled back to catch every word. "He's got plenty of that." They signed the paperwork that afternoon. The next visit was scheduled for the following week. Back home, Karen filled Echo's bowl and leaned against the counter, watching him eat. There was a different energy to him now, not the buzzing alertness of stress, but something closer to engagement, a curiosity, a readiness. She reached for the old leather collar with the K9 badge and traced a finger across the worn grooves. "You're not done serving," she whispered, "just serving differently." The following Monday, they arrived at the Maple Grove Memory Center. Karen was nervous. Echo wasn't. As they entered the lobby, a thin man in a wheelchair pointed at Echo and smiled wide. "Army dog?" he called. "Police," Karen replied. The man nodded. "Still looks like a soldier." Echo walked beside her slowly, tail low, body relaxed but observant. As they moved down the hall, doors creaked open and faces peeked out. A woman in a flowered robe reached out toward Echo's head. He stopped, and she touched his ears gently. "You remind me of Buster," she murmured. "He was my husband's dog. We lost him in '82. Echo leaned into her hand. By the end of the visit, 3 residents had smiled. 2 had spoken, who rarely. Who did. One had even patted his head and whispered, "You keep us safe, don't you?" Karen watched from the doorway, heart full and aching. When they returned to the car, Echo didn't collapse in exhaustion. Instead, he sat tall in the back seat, looking out the window as they drove, ears perked, Not for threats, but for something else. Possibility. Despite his progress, Echo still had his ghosts. Some nights, long after the lights were out and the world had settled into silence, he would stand at the window and stare into the dark like it was speaking to him. Karen had learned to recognize the signs: ears slightly forward, head tilted just so, muscles tight with memory. Not fear, not quite. Something deeper. The kind of watchfulness that had once meant life or death. He'd never whine or bark. He just watched. Karen didn't disturb him when he was like that. She simply let him be, leaving the bedroom door cracked open so he could come in when he was ready. Eventually he always did, settling at the foot of her bed with a quiet sigh. That sounded too much like grief, but those moments were fewer now. By day, Echo had begun to build a new rhythm: therapy visits, short play sessions with Mason, walks through the woods behind the neighborhood where the scent trails of deer and foxes offered a new kind of purpose. Karen saw it in the way he moved, less mechanical, more engaged. Still, there were shadows they hadn't yet faced, like the crate. It sat in the garage, gathering dust, a large black kennel with a faded blue blanket folded over the top. It had been Echo's mobile command post for years. His safe, placed between calls when they were on assignment and had to wait for hours in silence. Karen hadn't brought it into the house after they retired. It didn't feel right. This was supposed to be a new chapter after all, but Echo often wandered to the garage when the door was open. He'd sniff the base of the crate, circle it once, then leave, like he wasn't sure if it was supposed to. Come inside, or stay behind with the life they left. On a quiet Thursday afternoon, Karen made the decision. She cleared a corner of the living room, next to the bookshelf and under the window, where the sun streamed in during the mornings. Then, she and Mason, who had started coming over almost every afternoon, carried the crate in together. "Is it okay if we do this?" Mason asked, his small hands gripping the handle. Karen nodded. He needs to know it's still his, even if he doesn't sleep in it anymore. When they placed it down, Echo watched from the hallway, ears alert. Tail low. Karen stepped back. "Your call, buddy." Echo approached slowly, one paw after the other, nose twitching. He stopped in front of the open door and just looked inside. Then, to their surprise, he stepped in, sat down, and stayed there for almost half an hour. Karen and Mason sat on the couch, saying nothing. It wasn't a victory, not quite. But it was. Acknowledgement of a life once lived, of a role once filled. Echo didn't need to forget his past to find peace in his present. That weekend, they made their first visit to the library. The room was bright and filled with the soft murmur of pages turning. Children were already sitting in a half-circle on the rug when Karen and Echo arrived, and the librarian, a warm-faced woman named Jenna, smiled brightly. "Everyone," she said, "this is Echo. He's a special dog who used to work with the police. He's retired now, but he still likes to help people, especially if they read to him." Mason had come too. Not as a reader, he said reading aloud was cringe, but as an unofficial Echo handler. He wore a lanyard with a plastic badge. Karen had made for fun. Junior partner. The first little girl, a shy kindergartner named Leah, sat cross-legged and opened her picture book. She looked at Echo nervously. "He doesn't bite," she whispered. "Never," Mason said confidently, like he was Echo's personal PR manager. "He just listens. He's the best listener ever." Leah started reading. Echo sat in front of her, gaze steady, ears gently flicking with each word. She relaxed. Her voice grew louder. Then came the second reader, and the third. By the end of the hour, Echo had been read to by 5 children, petted by at least 10 more, and posed for a dozen photos. He didn't flinch once. Karen stood in the back, watching the children's faces, watching Echo's stillness. But it was not the tense stillness of a guard on duty. It was serenity. As they left, Jenna approached Karen. "You know," she said, "there was a boy last week. He has selective mutism, won't talk to adults, barely talks at home. But when Echo sat down beside him today, he whispered every line of his book, not loud enough for us to hear, but it was something." Karen smiled. "Echo has that effect." On the drive home, Mason chatted non-stop from the back seat about how Echo should have his own book, maybe even a comic, and how he was going to write it himself. Karen didn't interrupt. Echo, in his quiet dignity, listened through it all. That night, as rain tapped gently against the windows, Karen lit a candle and sat at the kitchen table. Echo lay nearby, paws crossed, eyes half closed. She opened an old photo album, pictures of Echo in his vest, standing proudly beside her, on patrol, at community events, even at the medal ceremony the year he saved a child lost in the woods. Karen turned the page, a photo of her, years younger, with her arm around a different partner, human, one who never came back from their final operation. Her throat tightened. Echo stirred and came to her side, nudging her hand. Karen smiled weakly. "You remember him, don't you?" Echo leaned against her leg. They sat like that for a while. Two veterans bound by memory and silence, finding their way forward through the past. When she finally rose to go to bed, Echo didn't follow right away. Instead, he walked over to the crate in the corner and curled up inside, not as a soldier waiting for orders, but as a dog who had earned his rest. Autumn rolled in quietly. The air turned crisp, and the trees lining Karen's neighborhood shifted. To shades of amber and rust, the world smelled of damp leaves and chimney smoke. Echo, once indifferent to the seasons, now paused to sniff the breeze, eyes closing as he soaked in the moment. His pace was slower these days, but Karen didn't mind. Their walks became meanders rather than missions. Where once Echo scouted for threats, now he watched squirrels, listened to birds, and sometimes, if he was feeling bold, chased falling leaves with a puppyish lurch that caught Karen off guard. He was aging. She could see it in the grey spreading through his muzzle, the stiffness in his hips, the way he sometimes hesitated before stepping up onto the porch. But with that age came softness, an ease she'd never thought possible from a dog forged in the crucible of service. Their days had a rhythm now. Monday and Friday were therapy visits. Tuesdays were for the library. Wednesday afternoons, Mason came by after school with a pocket full of dog treats and a list of missions he'd written up for Echo on lined notebook paper. Find the hidden toy. Check the backyard perimeter. Accept belly rubs from civilian. Echo followed them with patient dignity, tolerating even the mandatory dress code of silly scarves Mason insisted on draping around his neck. And Thursdays? Thursdays were just for the two of them. Karen started taking Echo to the lake again, just like they had in the early days of his training. She'd throw sticks, and he'd trot into the shallows to retrieve them, not because he had to, but because he wanted to. On the dock, they'd sit side by side, watching the water ripple. "You're not a working dog anymore," Karen said once, brushing the damp fur behind his ear. "But somehow you've never worked harder." Echo pressed his head gently against her shoulder. That evening, back at home, she opened a letter from the therapy center. It was simple. A thank you note. "Dear Karen and Echo, just a quick note to say thank you for your continued presence at the memory unit. Last week, Mr. Carter, who hasn't spoken clearly in months, asked where the officer was when Echo didn't show up on Monday. Your visits matter. Echo matters." Karen read the note twice, then placed it beside the others in a folder she kept tucked in the drawer. She'd never needed recognition, but knowing Echo's presence still had weight in the world, that meant everything. That night, she found Echo lying not in his crate but in the hallway, stretched out with his head on his paws. Not guarding, just being. She sat beside him and rested her back against the wall. "You're not who you used to be," she said softly, "and neither am I. But maybe that's okay." His tail thumped once, a quiet heartbeat of agreement. Winter came. The snow blanketed the world in silence. The kind Echo understood. Their walks grew shorter, the therapy sessions less frequent. Mason started coming over mostly to draw comics at the kitchen table while Echo dozed nearby. His comic was nearly done. The Amazing Echo and the Quiet Watch, he called it. Echo's steps grew slower still. On the last Sunday in February, the sky was clear and cold, the air brittle with frost. Karen took Echo to the lake one more time. He didn't run, but he walked down to the edge, dipped a paw into the water, then turned and looked back at her, not waiting for an order, just acknowledging her. Sharing something wordless, she sat beside him on the dock. "You did everything I ever asked of you," she whispered. "And more. I hope you know that." Echo leaned his weight into her. They watched the frozen lake shimmer beneath the pale winter sun. He passed quietly in his sleep 2 weeks later. No pain, no struggle. Karen found him curled in his crate, head resting gently on the old service vest she'd folded into a pillow months before. His expression was peaceful, his body finally at rest. The house was impossibly quiet after that. The absence echoed everywhere, in the stillness of the mornings, in the lack of nails tapping on the hardwood floor, in the way Karen unconsciously reached for a leash that wasn't there, but she wasn't alone. Cards arrived from the library, from the therapy center, from Mason's parents. One came from a woman Karen didn't know, a daughter of a patient in the memory unit. "My mother remembered her own dog for the first a time in years because of yours." Echo gave her back a piece of herself. "I hope you know what a gift that was." Karen smiled through tears. She scattered Echo's ashes at the lake, brought Mason with her. He wore a tie. Echo's comic was finished by then. They laid a copy beside, the water with a stone to hold it down. On the title page, Mason had written, "For Echo, the best partner, the quietest hero." Spring came. Karen adopted another dog, not a replacement, just a new chapter. A clumsy, long-legged golden mix named Murphy who loved socks and had no idea what sit meant. He was chaos, but he brought laughter back into the house, and Echo, she knew, would have approved. On Murphy's first visit to the therapy center, he barked at a tissue box and tried to eat a name tag. Karen laughed harder than she had in months. Later that night, as Murphy finally fell, asleep on the rug, Karen looked over at the crate in the corner. She hadn't moved it. She never would. Inside sat the vest, the badge, and Echo's collar coiled neatly like it was still waiting for one more mission. Karen stood there a long time. "Rest easy, partner," she whispered. "We've got it from here." And with that, she turned off the light.